We're talking about a rectangle that is longer to the north and south and to the east and west. The actual area, well, it's really called the inner court. It's really inner courts, plural. It's made up of 3 courts, but it's sometimes singularized as the inner court, which concerns the sanctuary itself and the surrounding area, is another rectangle itself. So we're talking about a rectangle inside of a rectangle. This rectangle, however, is longer east and west than it is north and south. It fits inside the larger rectangle, which I showed up here earlier, and the smaller one fits up in the northwest corner of the larger rectangle. Now, it may seem like I have it centered just up to the north. That's just because I had to make it big enough, this rectangle, to show you the features on the inside of it. It really should be shrunk down a little bit so that you think of it up to the top of this and over to the left-hand side. That's just exactly the way that it was situated. And if you measured that, all right, see, I got it over there further anyway. So technically I'm right. It's over to the western side. But that doesn't do it quite service. We really should almost like have it cut off right here, but then I couldn't show enough details. So we're going to be looking at these courts. I think I'll start down at the bottom. It doesn't really make a lot of difference. We'll start down with the bottom where you see it's just a big open area. Since this smaller rectangle running longer east and west than north and south fits up to the top or to the north and over to the left or to the west, that leaves us a big open area to the south. If you'll turn over to Revelation chapter 11, I think I'll start with a passage here. We don't have a lot of New Testament passages we're going to look at, but we do have a few, and I would say that the most interesting one, the one you should remember, is Revelation 11. It's the only passage we have in the Bible that says it this way. So it makes it unique and eminently worth remembering. Revelation 11, verses 1 and 2. You may have seen this before. Well, if you've ever read the whole Bible, obviously you have seen it before. But I wonder whether or not you understood what you were reading. John, the seer, is receiving this revelation, or vision of the future, apocalypse. He writes, "There was given me a reed like unto a rod." Now that's like a yardstick, but reeds were much longer than a yard, more like 3 or 4 or 5 yards long. There was given me, and Ezekiel, it has the same experience over in his prophecy in chapter 40. If you just take a note of that, we don't have time to look at that, but in chapter 40. So something is similar between John's experience here of having a vision, by the way, of a temple, which is what we're going to read here, and Ezekiel's vision of a temple. And more than that, of being given a reed, and then certain measurements are enacted. So a reed is anywhere from maybe 10 to 20 feet long, but think of it like a long measuring rod. A reed like unto a rod, and the angels stood, saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God." Now, I told you earlier when we started studying the temple that there are 2 different terms, the hieron and the naos term, and Revelation, for the most part, has that specific sanctuary term, the naos term. Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. Now, I'll come back and comment in just a moment, but watch as we read. "But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles."
Hallelujah.
Notice I have a word spelled up here, Gentiles. "And the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. Well, of course, this has nothing to do with, when John's receiving this revelation, there is no temple, there is no altar, there are no courts. That has all been destroyed about 30 years prior to John receiving this revelation. So he's not having anything to say about that. He's not talking about that. He's saying something in the future. So it stands to reason that the tribulation temple will be built on the order of the earlier temple, or Herod's temple. Revelation 11 seems to indicate that. Let's go back and see what he's saying. "There was given me a reed like a rod, and the angel stood, and he said to me, Rise and measure the temple of God." Get a measurement of it. Now, Yeah, prophecy is a little difficult to interpret, but prophecy will interpret prophecy. Scripture will interpret Scripture, and I think, what is it, Zechariah 2 has the same situation of measuring of the land and city and temple, Zechariah 2. And measurement signifies different things, such as conquest, things like that, which is what Zechariah is talking about. Rise and measure the temple of God with this rod. So, if it's, let's say, a 10-foot rod, then he'd be laying it down 10 feet, then you go 10 feet, and lay it down again 10 feet, 30 feet, or however far he's got to go. And the altar, well, we know there are two altars. We've talked about one of them so far, really specifically, the altar of burnt incense, which is on the inside of the sanctuary. That's not what he's talking about here, though, because John's not a priest. He wouldn't be allowed in to measure that. And them that worship therein. Measure the temple. So he's told to measure three things here. Measure the temple, measure the altar, measure the people. Well, how do you measure people? He's not saying, like, find out if they're 5'3" or 6'2". Measure them means find out how many there are of them. Count how many worshipers there are. The NIV translates that as count the number of worshipers. So that's what measure would mean when it applies to people. Count the worshipers therein. Now, they must be in a certain place, because then in verse 2 he goes on to say, but the court which is without the temple, leave that court out, and don't measure it. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months, which is a period of 3.5 years. If you start dividing your 12s, it's a period of approximately 3.5 years. Now, the passage is saying a whole lot about what we have yet to see happen in Israel and in Jerusalem, that there will be a temple built. There has to be. This prophecy would never be fulfilled, and God does not lie. He doesn't reveal things that don't take place. And they're going to be Jewish worshipers. There's going to be an altar, and by virtue of the fact the two courts are being contrasted, the so-called inner and outer court, it couldn't have reference to the altar on the inside of the sanctuary, because no one would have liberty with that except the priest or the Levites, or really only the priests, not even the Levites, except maybe in some cleaning duties. This has to refer to an altar of sacrifice on the outside, which we're going to be talking about before we're through tonight. So what I'm saying is sacrifice has to be restored then. There's going to be sacrifice restored. And they're going to be pious Jewish worshipers. Count the number of the worshipers there. Won't be any Gentiles in there. That'll be against Jewish law. There'll be a whole lot of Jewish people in there. But the court which is without the temple is the so-called outer court. Leave out and measure it not, for it's given to the Gentiles. Well, that's the same as Herod's temple. And then he goes on to say, once he mentions the word Gentiles, and that brings him to another prediction here, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 3.5 years, 42 months. Well, that evidently would refer to the second half of the tribulation period, whenever Antichrist breaks his covenant with the nation of Israel, according to Daniel chapter 9 and his so-called 77s, or the 70 weeks of Daniel's prophecy. And Antichrist overthrows worship, sets himself up, and the Gentiles just overrun the city in the last half of the tribulation period. All right, so we're not talking about Book of Revelation or really the fulfillment of that. We're simply looking at that to see that it speaks of two courts, the inner and the outer. The inner being for the Jews, the outer being for the Gentiles. So let's start then with this outer court, the Gentile court, which makes up most of the area, as you can see on this diagram on the Temple Mount. Now, we don't have a precise measurement of how big the Gentile court is. We do have some things concerning the measurement of the temple area, the sanctuary area. And so by means of deduction, it would appear as though the Gentile court was extremely large. I mean, very large. Probably, well, if we're talking about a 35-acre Temple Mount, probably 75% of that, if not more, would be part of the court of the Gentiles. The court of the Gentiles would be surrounded, except on the northern side, the top side, with these colonnades, or the porticos. And most of our important famous gates find their entrance or exit via the court of the Gentiles. So this is probably where Jesus spent most of his time teaching. I said last time that in the eastern colonnade, the so-called Porch of Solomon, Solomon's porch of the book of Acts, this is where the rabbis spent their time teaching, and evidently Jesus would have spent his time there because we find, for instance, in Acts chapter 5, the early Christian community meeting there. Now, because Herod himself was not a pure Jew, but he had Gentile blood in him, he thought very favorably of the area of the Gentiles being an area into which he could come, Herod the Great. So, as a result of that, he lavished most of his expense on the court of the Gentiles. We've already looked at all of these colonnades and porticos surrounding it, and they were very, very beautiful works of Corinthian architectural style. The whole court of the Gentiles is paved with very elaborate marble of all different shapes and sizes and all different colors. It was a very beautiful, beautiful area, all paved with solid marble. Into this area, Jewish men could come, Jewish women could come, even Gentiles could come. The lowest one on the rung, that is the one which can go no further, generally serves as the one from whom the name of the court is taken. Jewish men can go in here, but it's not called the court of the Jews. The lowest one, the one who can go into this place and no further, the name of the court is generally derived from that fact. So it's called the court of the Gentiles. But there were some restrictions, however. People who were ritually unclean in the area of discharges, according to Leviticus chapter 15, women who had not been purified or had not reached the time even, which is a couple of weeks later, the time of purification after childbirth and so forth, would not even be allowed entrance into the court of the Gentiles. Now, as I've mentioned earlier, this B down here at the bottom stands for baths. There were baths for ritual cleansing and purifying here, but there were some things that even that couldn't take care of, because according to Leviticus 15, you had to go through a certain period of time before you could even be cleansed, such as childbirth. You have a period of 33 days for a boy being born, or 66 days for a girl being born. That's also back in the book of Leviticus. And whether or not they rigidly maintained that quota of 33 or 66 days, they had some period anyway, that they were ritually unclean after childbirth and could make no entrance into any part of the temple, including the court of the Gentiles. However, physically handicapped people were allowed in here. Now that's a defect according to the Mosaic law. If you turn over to Matthew 21, chapter 21, verse 14, it's not God's will, it's a sign of a curse and not a blessing for a person to be physically handicapped. In the Old Testament, the physically handicapped could not serve in the priestly function or ministry. But the Jews did make allowance into this area for the permanently physically handicapped. Matthew 21, well, we need to start with verse 14. And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. 21:14. The chief priests and scribes saw these wonderful things, then they were sore displeased. Matthew chapter 21 and verse 14. So the physically handicapped were allowed to come into this area. Also, it's in this area that you would find the situation of John 2, verses 13 through 17, or even the preceding two verses here in our passage in Matthew 21, unfolding itself. And that is Jesus casting out of the temple the changers of money, overturning their tables, driving out the oxen, driving out those that traded in doves and pigeons and so forth. Now, I think we're going to end up saying a little about this later on, but let me say a few things about it now. This is over in John 2, verses 13 to 17. That was the first time that he did it. Jesus did it on a second occasion. I didn't mean to imply with what I said earlier that Matthew 21 is a parallel to John 2. It's a parallel in what took place, but not when it took place. There were two drivings out of the temple. The second one's also recorded, I believe, over in Mark chapter 11. But all of this, remember how much time we spent last time on the royal colonnade, or the royal portico, which is this southern area here. This was the largest area. This is where all the stalls were set up. Again, remember, we're talking about something 300 yards by 500 yards, this whole area here. You got 300 yards across by 100 feet deep. 300 yards by 100 feet deep. You have a lot of room, in other words. Here, all the stalls were set up. Now, you're not going to have like 1 or 2 cows or 1 ox or 6 oxen in there. I mean, we're talking about people coming into the temple for sacrificial purposes all the time. There must have been dozens and scores and hundreds of animals that are kept in this part of the temple area. You'd want to keep the animals out of the sun and the heat, so they were kept in the royal portico or colonnade. And of course, you'd find some out here in the regular Gentile area. So it's no surprise that our Lord comes in, driving them out, saying, you've made the house of God a place of merchandise and a den of thieves here. And it's for several different reasons. He said that you're confusing the Gentiles. If you go over and look at that passage in Mark 11, as well as the one here in Matthew 21 and in John 2, you're confusing the Gentiles by making mockery of spiritual matters by having all of this financial enterprise taking place inside here. And they charged an exorbitant rate of interest on the exchange of foreign coins for the Tyrian coin from Tyre and Zidon and Phoenicia, which was the only one allowed of the Jews. And they, of course, kept the tax. And who do you think controlled this whole business of the sheep and the oxen? Well, the high priesthood. And they made, as we say, a killing on it all. It was controlled by the house of Annas, A-N-N-A-S, who's mentioned in John 18, by the house of Annas, and by that I mean by his sons, his descendants, all of his relatives. Now, they actually had 2 setups for the selling of oxen and cattle and sheep and lambs and dove and so forth. One on the Mount of Olives. We never have a record of Jesus going and doing away with that. Not that he would not have been opposed to the fact the high priesthood was controlling everything, but it was more or less legitimate. You've got to have animals to sacrifice, and if you're coming from Rome or Corinth as Passover pilgrim Jew, you can hardly bring your animals across the Mediterranean on a ship with you. You're going to bring money. You're going to sell your animals back home, turn that into money, bring your money, buy animals here right at the place in Jerusalem, and then have them sacrificed. You have to have them bought somewhere. There has to be a place for them to be purchased. The Mount of Olives would be a legitimate place. Inside the temple precincts, according to our Lord, would not be a legitimate place. So here's where you find that situation in John 2 unfolding. And as you see, most of this spreads out to the south and then also to the east of the temple precincts. So court of the Gentiles would actually be down south, which is what we're seeing now, as well as over in this area too. If we move this over a little bit, court of the Gentiles would run over to the east and the whole southern area. All right, there's court of the Gentiles. Now, let's work our way up. If you've got questions along the way, you'll have to stop me. This is where Jesus evidently spends a whole lot of his time, because this is where he can reach the people. He goes in there doing a lot of healing a lot of the time. And the people that would need healing couldn't go into these courts. These handicapped people, they would be down here. And he would do his healing there. And he would do his teaching over here in Solomon's Porch. So that also is included in the court of the Gentiles. So that would keep him most of the time out in this general area. Okay, then as we work our way north or west from the court of the Gentiles, we would first of all run into a stone wall, a lattice stone wall, several feet high, that evidently ran around as I just have diagrammed. We're not for certain whether it ran around the whole way. There is that possibility. That depends on one's interpretation of a lot of different things. In other words, that depends on whether or not one thinks that there's a very small area, both to the west and to the north, of the temple area proper itself that could be considered part of the court of the Gentiles. That's a debated point. But we know anyway that there was a small wall, 3 or 4 or 5 feet high. We've already talked about this on several occasions earlier, on which at regular intervals were stone inscriptions written in Greek and Latin, warning on pain of death the entrance of a Gentile. As a matter of fact, one of these has been discovered back in the 1870s, 1871, and another one discovered in 1935 or 36. I think the first one discovered is in a museum in Istanbul, and I can't recall right now where the second one is. Here's what it said, and I'll quote, "No Gentile to enter the fence and barrier around the temple. Anyone caught is answerable to himself for the ensuing death." I'll read that again. "No Gentile to enter the fence and barrier around the temple. Anyone caught is answerable to himself for the ensuing death." So this was strictly off limits for any Gentile. The Gentiles had to stay in the court of the Gentiles. And they were warned at regular intervals, either all the way around the temple area proper or to the south and to the east along this stone lattice fence. Now, you see, I think I said this last time also, I have simplified things, not showing you all the steps and terraces and steps and terraces and steps and landings and so forth. But there's always a whole series of these. I mean, steps would have been everywhere. You would have had steps probably that led up to this stone lattice wall. The other side, there's another wall. I've left this out. There's so many things here. Another wall that was 60 feet high that either encircled the entire temple area or, like I have diagrammed here, it went around just on the south and the east. 60 feet high. And of course you'd have steps leading up to that as well. I just have chosen to leave all of that off because we're not trying to look at this exhaustively. Now if you'll turn over to Ephesians chapter 2, it's very tempting, and I believe that it's true, to see a reference to this lattice stone wall in one of Paul's epistles, Ephesians chapter 2. It's very tempting to see a reference to this wall in Ephesians 2, if we'll start with verse 11. I don't see any reason to deny it. "Wherefore remember that ye being in time past," he's writing to Ephesians, Gentile people, "Gentiles in the flesh, who were called uncircumcision by that which is called the circumcision," that is, by the Jewish nation, "in the flesh made by hands, that at that time ye were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise." We're back to our diatheke term there from Wednesday night, and we're back to a plural form of it. "Having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of Christ." Ye who are far off. Now, that wouldn't tell us, we couldn't prove anything by that. We're going to be able to prove something as we go on. But what he's talking about is you who formerly were restricted down there to the court of the Gentiles. You who are far off from this area right here, this little box or cube, which is the Holy of Holies. You which were far off are now made nigh by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace, who hath made both one. Both what? Well, Jews and Gentiles. Hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. This is exactly what Paul has reference to here. This wall, that's why I mention it so often, because now it helps you when you read Ephesians 2 here. And we've actually archaeologically uncovered some of these inscriptions here. So here's what the Jews were saying of you. "No Gentile to enter the fence or barrier around the temple. Anyone caught is answerable to himself for the ensuing death." And so Paul has a whole twist on that. You see what the writer of Hebrews is doing. He's making a play on the fact that the veil has been torn here, that was an actual act of Almighty God himself, signified by the tearing of the veil, that Christ has died and the entrance into the holiest of all has been made open. The way has been paved for anyone, Jew or Gentile, and that includes all Jews, not just the priestly class. Well, now, Paul's not dealing with that. Paul's dealing with this. Of course, he's wanting to say something slightly different. He's talking about the joining in one church or one body, the Jewish people and all the Gentile nations out there. So he makes a play on the breaking down of this wall here, called in the KJV the middle wall of partition. I just checked to see what some of the other translations had to say. Most of them say something about a wall or a barrier. For instance, the New American Standard Bible says the barrier of the dividing wall. Several different translations, such as the Jerusalem Bible, Williams, F.F. Bruce, and Moffat, translate this way: the barrier which kept us apart. The barrier which kept us apart. Or several translations not only see in this a dividing wall or a barrier, but the theme of hostility. For instance, Weymouth's translation has this, the hostile dividing wall. Or the Revised Standard Version and the New International Version both have the same, the dividing wall of hostility. And then the Berkeley Bible just comes right out and tells us what's going on, adding in a few words. They call it the barrier that separates Jews and Gentiles. Well, you don't have those two words in the Greek, Jews and Gentiles, but that in effect is what Paul is saying. The barrier that separates Jews and Gentiles. So I find that to be a very, very interesting reference there. Now, it was destroyed along with everything else, this wall, in AD 70. Well, Paul is writing Ephesians prior to AD 70. Paul surely knows from, if he hasn't read the Gospels, he surely knows from talking with other Christians, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple in Matthew 24 and the parallel passages in Mark and Luke. But Paul sees this actually already accomplished. This wall has already been demolished. Of course, he's speaking in a spiritual sense here. This wall has already been demolished in Jesus Christ. So I think in verse 13 of Ephesians 2, Paul does have reference to the inner and the outer court. He's not after the same theme as the writer of Hebrews, the inner and outer sanctuary. He's wanting to talk about Jews and Gentiles. So reading that passage now again with that light, but now in Christ Jesus, ye who sometimes were far off, way down here in the court of the Gentiles, are made nigh by the blood of Christ, for he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh, and so forth. And another interesting thing is those two words, the middle wall and partition, both of those words are found in Josephus. He uses both of those terms to speak of the same wall. Josephus wrote in Greek. He uses the same phrase that Paul uses here. So I don't see any reason to deny the fact that Paul has reference to that very wall we're discussing. And Paul ought to know something about it. If you'll turn over to Acts 21. Now, Acts 21 took place prior to Paul writing Ephesians. Paul ought to know something about that wall, because in Acts 21, verses 27 through 29, he was accused, falsely so, but he was accused of taking one of his Gentile companions beyond this wall, and it enraged the people who control the Temple Mount. So Paul should know something about this wall, and I'm sure when he's writing Ephesians, he has this thought in mind of the experience he had back in Acts 21. Acts 21 in verse 27. When the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews which were of Asia, so they weren't native Palestinian Jews, but they're Jews, when they saw him, Paul, in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place, and further brought Greeks, that is Gentiles, also into the temple, and hath polluted this holy place. Well, again, not even Paul could go into the temple. No one could go in there but a priest. So they don't mean into the temple, but they mean into this area, into the Jewish court area. And the accusation is falsely made that Paul took, I think it was Trophimus, down in verse 29, that Paul took Trophimus, an Ephesian Gentile, beyond this wall. And, of course, had that been the case, then that man would have died. Trophimus, we wouldn't have to worry about him getting sick over there in 2 Timothy 4. He would have gotten worse than sick. He would have been dead. So the divine sickness people couldn't have used that for a proof text, could they? Old dead Trophimus wouldn't have gotten sick and been left by Paul and Miletus. But no, he didn't go in there. That's a trumped-up charge. Evidently what had taken place, though, is that Paul had been in the temple area with Trophimus, and the Jewish people knew who Paul was. These are people from Asia. They know what's going on. He's an Ephesian. They're probably from Ephesus. They know who Trophimus is also. They can recognize him by sight, by face. So they've seen Paul in the temple area. They've seen Trophimus in there. But, of course, they've been out in the Gentile courts. Then maybe later someone saw Paul in a Jewish court. And so they're putting 2 and 2 together and getting 17 or 48. Oh, that must have meant while we weren't looking, Paul also brought Trophimus in here. And, their reasoning is not totally invalid, because they'd think, well, after all, this is the man, and we just read in the beginning of verse 28, who's teaching that all these customs should be abolished. So I'm sure he was just living out his own doctrine, that these customs should be abolished, and he brought Trophimus actually into the temple. But that's not what happened. Trophimus would have been killed had that happened, but that's not what took place. So I think Paul probably had this in the back of his mind, that there was a wall. No Gentile was allowed beyond it, and it cost Paul imprisonment for 2 years. You see, this is what causes him to be imprisoned, this one event here, that dividing wall of hostility. A false charge laid at his feet on behalf of Trophimus that caused all of his problems and imprisonment, so I'm sure. And after all, Trophimus was from where? Ephesus. So you put all this together and it makes a lot of sense then. Just take your time and don't panic when you read the Bible. All right, let's go on then. Let's work our way up to the temple area proper. If I don't watch out, I'll run out of time again tonight. I better get talking here. Okay, Josephus and other Jewish writings tell us that there were 9 gates. Well, one writing tells us that there were 10, but I think that there were probably 9 gates that led into the inner court, using it as a generic organic whole here, the inner versus the outer court, although we're going to divide the inner up into 3 courts itself. Now, we're not talking about these purple gates out here. That is to get into the temple precincts or compound. We're talking about these gates. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. In other words, 4 on the south, 4 on the north, 1, other sources say 2, on the east, 0 on the west. I can't even tell you how much I've enjoyed teaching these messages on the temple, because I know it'll open your eyes so you can actually picture what's going on whenever you read the 4 Gospels. I have just thoroughly enjoyed this study, even though it's not been in very much detail. I think it's been enough so that you can capture these pictures in your mind. Let me say it again. 4 gates on the south, 4 on the north. I'm going to say 1 on the east and none on the west. Now, let's approach our way up ceremonially. So we'll go from the court of the Gentiles into the court of the women. The court of the women will be the next court up. That's the next group of people, would be the women. Of course, that'd be Jewish women now. Gentile women couldn't come in here. They'd have to stay out here in the court of the Gentiles. There were 3 gates that led into the court of the women. 1 from the south, 1 from the north, 1 from the east. So you see what that does then. For of these 9 gates getting into the inner court, that leaves the majority of them, 2/3 of them, 6 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for this area here, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, once you get inside the court of the women, which is not that big of an area, and there are other divisions, like there evidently were galleries that ran around like this. I mean, you know what a gallery is, like in an old theater or something. There were galleries that ran, but we don't need to get into all that. It just confuses matters to draw some of that stuff up here. But I will just mention at the 4 corners of what is supposed to be basically a square, perhaps a little bit of a rectangle, at the 4 corners are 4 certain chambers. The northwest, the chamber of lepers. The northeast, the chamber of wood. The southeast, the chamber of the Nazarites. Southwest, the chamber of oils. And those are rather self-explanatory. According to Numbers 6, for example, whenever a Nazarite had gone through his Nazaritic vows and it was time to break his vow and so forth, and there was a pulling of the hair and a sacrifice that would need to be made, well, the pulling of the hair and all the ritual involved would take place here in the chamber of the Nazarites, which is a part of the court of the women. Men, by the way, could go in here. Jewish men could go in here. Remember, it's the one who cannot go beyond that who serves as the name tag for the area. Women, Jewish women may not go beyond this. Men may. They can come into this and go beyond it. Jesus was in the court of the women all the time. But women couldn't go beyond that, so it receives their name. The court of oils, you know, for all the oils that are going to be needed in all the ceremony, you're going to have a lot of firewood to keep the fires going, the chamber of wood, the chamber of lepers. That goes back to places like Luke 17, where Jesus said, go show yourself to the priest. Those 10 lepers that were cleansed, this is where their ceremony took place. And this is a whole issue in itself, but it's a proof text and proof idea for divine healing in the Old Covenant. Leprosy is an incurable disease. So if God makes wherewithal a provision for the leper to go and offer a sacrifice and be pronounced clean by the priest, he had to get healed some way. That medically and physically is an impossibility. The only way a leper can get healed is supernaturally. That's interesting. The Jews knew that. They've got an actual area, the chamber of the lepers, so that if a leper got healed supernaturally, and who's to say, or why should we think that there weren't Jewish people who had leprosy, you know, in the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, or whenever Jesus was 15 years old or something, who trusted God. They had their Old Testament, I am the Lord that healeth thee, who trusted God and got healed and had to come in here and show themselves to the priest. There'd be no reason to have... In other words, the Jews didn't build this because of Jesus' healing ministry. They had to have been getting healed otherwise, supernaturally from God. They didn't build that because of Jesus' healing ministry. They were opposed to his healing ministry. We just saw that in Matthew 21, verses 14 and 15. They were sore displeased when the blind saw and the lame walked and the lepers were cleansed. So I find that to be very interesting. There's a whole sermon in itself right there. Yeah. Okay, we don't know too much about this southern gate, which would have been a very popular one because a lot of women would have come from the south down here, Robinson's Arch, double, triple hold the gate, and come up through the court of the Gentiles and come in here. We don't know too much about the one to the north. This is the big important one over to the east that would have had steps like this, similar to this gate, leading up to it. Now, Josephus speaks of 2 important gates that are somehow connected to the court of the women. Or, let me say it another way. Josephus, he either speaks of 2 gates or he speaks of one and the same gate by 2 names. Now, this will tie into Scripture here in just a moment. Josephus speaks of the Nicanor gate, Nicanor. By the way, this diagram here has been copied out of the Encyclopedia Judaica, a Jewish encyclopedia. This is the standard understanding of what the temple looked like according to Jewish people down to this day, and I think it's fairly reliable. Other diagrams will differ slightly. As I say, others will have two gates into the court of the women over here on the east, but Encyclopedia Judaica, Jewish encyclopedia, has only one. He speaks of the gate of Nicanor. He also speaks of the Corinthian bronze gate. And he has a lot to say about the Corinthian bronze gate. And that seems to be because of this. All these other gates here were normal gates made out of wood, covered, plated with silver and gold. The other 8 gates that led into the temple area were normal gates made out of wood, had a wooden solid core, and they were coated or covered with silver or gold. Evidently, there was one gate that stood out as a unique exception. Josephus calls it the Corinthian bronze gate. He describes it as exceedingly beautiful. That's an essential quote from him. Exceedingly beautiful. It glistened like the noonday sun. And it was made out of, well, its name, Corinthian bronze. Now, some people have said that the Corinthian bronze gate of Josephus is the same as the Nicanor gate of Josephus. I don't think that's true. Those who have held that have differed among themselves as to where to place this gate, on the western or the eastern side of the court of the women. In other words, this gate right here, the western, or this side, the eastern of the court of the women. But the standard interpretation, the one that I happen to believe to be true, is that those are names for 2 different gates. That's not 2 names for one gate in Josephus. There is a Corinthian bronze gate, there is a Nicanor gate. The former is to be equated with Acts chapter 3, Luke's Gate Beautiful. It's called Gate Beautiful. If you'll turn over to Acts 3. Why would you just call one gate Gate Beautiful when you've got 8 of them made out of silver and gold? They're all beautiful, but that one of them received that as its name, no other gate. This isn't Gates Beautiful, this is the Gate Beautiful, or we would say in English the beautiful gate, must mean it has to be different. And since from Josephus' writings and Jewish writings we know that of those 9 gates, one was different. Now you might think gold and silver is more beautiful than bronze. Don't let that enter your mind or the argument here. 8 of those is the same, one is different. Josephus describes it, and I quote, exceedingly beautiful. It only makes sense that this is the gate of the book of Acts. Acts 3 and verse 1, Now Peter and John went up together into the temple at the hour of prayer, being the 9th hour, and a certain man, lame from his mother's womb, was carried, whom they laid daily at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful. Which is called Beautiful. Now here's what I believe, and most people are in agreement with me here. This is Nicanor Gate, on the western side of the court of the women that leads into another court we'll get to here in a moment. You see my B underneath this. This is Gate Beautiful, on the eastern side of the court of the women. It was the largest of the 1, 2, 3 gates that led into the court of the women. It was the largest, the most beautiful, the most outstanding one, made of its own special material. Say, why that one made that way and none of the rest of these? Well, eastward focus here. We've seen that in Ezekiel's book. There's something special about eastward focus. That's important here. I think that's why they made it out of a different material. Remember I said that the physically handicapped people could be anywhere in the court of the Gentiles. That seems to be true according to Jewish law. If we make these one and the same gate, which some people do, and then oftentimes they will say it's over here on the western side of the court of the women, I don't see how that can be true, because I don't think physically handicapped people were allowed in the court of the women here. But if what I'm saying is true, then it all fits together according to all the sources that we have, that this man was sitting out here on one of these steps. He was carried by friends or relatives daily to the eastern gate of the court of the women, called in Josephus the Corinthian bronze gate, or called by Luke the Gate Beautiful, or the Beautiful Gate to ask alms. And Peter and John are going into the temple area to worship, and so I find it interesting they're not using this gate, which is not used a whole lot, or the northern one, but the eastern one. That's the big, important one that would receive and exit most of the traffic. Now, another word about the court of the women, or the Gentile court that surrounded that. We're not exactly for sure, but it seems to be the court of the women. Against the wall inside, there were 13 chests with trumpet-like receptacles. You know what a trumpet looks like. You know, picture a big box or a big chest and a trumpet receptacle sticking out from it that served as a treasury. 13 of these. 13 chests with trumpet-like receptacles. 9 of them were for legally required Jewish offerings. You can't legally require anything of the Gentiles, so that's what makes me tend to think that these chests are found on the inside of the court of the women. They can't be any beyond that, that's for sure, as we'll see here in a moment. 9 of them were for legally required gifts. 4 of them were for voluntary offerings. If you turn over to Luke 21, verses 1 to 4, we have a reference to this treasury. We have a reference to this treasury. Against the wall, somewhere on the inside. We don't know if it's down here, to the south, or up to the north. Somewhere against the wall in there. 13 chests with trumpet-like receptacles, 9 for legally required gifts, and 4 were for voluntary offerings. Do you remember the story from Sunday school of the woman who put her 2 mites in? Mites is not a good word. Lepta is the word, but we'll leave it mites since that's what we know it as. He looked up and saw the rich men, so they'd be allowed into this area, casting their gifts into the treasury. He saw also a certain poor widow casting in thither 2 mites. And he said, I think this is found over in the end of Mark 12 also, of a truth I say unto you, that this poor widow hath cast in more than they all. For all these have of their abundance cast in unto the offerings of God. But she of her penury, that is, of her poverty, hath cast in all the living that she had. So in other words, it has to be in an area that is accessible to Jewish women. It couldn't be any beyond that court, although some have argued for it existing somewhere along a wall of a Gentile court. We see also over in John chapter 8 and verse 20, John 8:20, as Jesus is teaching, notice where he is. John 8:20, these words spake Jesus in the treasury as he taught in the temple. Well, he didn't climb into one of those boxes. He wasn't inside the treasury. And he wasn't in the temple, as we've said over and over again. All this would mean in a case like this is he was near the treasury. He was in the treasury area. If you want to use that pronoun in, then you've got to add an area after it. He was in the area of the treasury, that is, of these 13 collection boxes, as he taught in the temple. So we see the treasury mentioned, and we have reference to that in Jewish writings as well. Okay, let's continue. If you don't have any questions about that court, there's the court of the women, which is also called the first court. That is the first court on the Jewish side, on the inside here. So we go through Gate Beautiful. Jewish men would be coming to court of the Gentiles, court of the women. Then here we're over to Nicanor Gate, which is a big, huge gate, again with evidently round steps leading up to it, terraces, platforms, steps leading up, and so forth. They'd go through a gate, which would mean this all would be one large wall. And they come into, you see my eye there, the court of Israel, or it's also called the court of the men. It has 2 names, the court of Israel or the court of the men. Only Jewish men will be allowed in here. Now there are just all types of different cubby holes running along the outside of this wall. I've only drawn one of them that we'll talk about here in a moment, down to the extreme southeast in this area. And again, there are two opinions as to the layout of the court of Israel. Notice the way I have it, it's the smallest of all the courts. It's a long strip just inside Nicanor Gate, right in front of the temple area, the temple sanctuary, that runs to the north and the south. It evidently was on the order of something like 15 feet wide, maybe. That's all. Not very wide at all. Very, very small area. Other people have argued that it also extended down the sides like this. So we really don't know. That's two different options there. It either extended down the side, or I tend to believe that it was just in the front, so I'm going to leave it that way. Into this area, Jesus could come, his apostles could come, any Jewish men could come. Then you would have another little dividing wall, like this wall between Jewish and Gentile area, and you'll then be going into the final court. Among all the various cubby holes and priestly residences, we know there were priestly residences in here in the court of the priests where they could stay overnight and live, and the high priest was sequestered there on the evening before the Day of Atonement. We'll talk about that later and why that happened. But of all those, I'm just going to mention the one down here to the extreme southeast, which is called the Chamber of Hewn Stone. The Chamber of Hewn, H-E-W-N, stone. The rest of them are not worth our mentioning tonight. The Chamber of Hewn Stone. Why do I mention this? This was the place where the Sanhedrin held their official councils. This was the meeting place, the official meeting place of the Sanhedrin. And you know they're on your outline for us to discuss later. So when they're meeting in an official capacity, and they're not meeting at night over in Caiaphas' house like they did whenever they were trying Jesus, and that was illegal to do, then this is where they met, the Chamber of Hewn Stone. All right, and then finally, tonight, we go into, there'd be a gate, or several gates that would lead into P, the court of the priests. So you've got three Jewish courts, the women, the men, the priests. Various things are found in this court. Like I say, there are just all types of little things all along the side, buildings, and just all types of things along the side. We don't need to get into that. I'll just mention three things in particular inside. Immediately inside and to the left, or to the south, would be the altar of burnt offering. I believe that as you stood here, and women could do this, they could stand at Nicanor Gate and look in to see the temple. I believe that you had an unobstructed view of the temple, that the altar of burnt offering would not impede your look, but it would be to the south or to the left as soon as you walked in. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Then to the southwest of it would be the huge laver for washing. That's about where the laver would be. Then to the north of all of this, you see these two little rectangles that I have drawn, would be the slaughterhouses. This would be the area where that huge exposed stone, which is part of the Dome of the Rock, it makes up the centerpiece, the focal point of the Dome of the Rock in Israel today, that's where that would be found, because that was a slaughtering stone. Animals would be slaughtered on top of that. So this is your slaughter area up here to the north. Now, I've got a little bit of time left, and I want to concentrate on this altar of burnt offering to again impress you, and I think you're going to be surprised. At least I hope you are. I shouldn't be here teaching you this. We already know all this. You're going to be surprised with the size of this. Now, let me just give you my own little thought pattern and background, and I'm sure yours is the same. I know whenever I first got saved and started reading the Bible, and I'd read about the altar burnt offering, what could I think of but a campfire? You know, a campfire, where you put some stones up and build a little situation there. And then as you go along in your Christian life and you read some more and you find out animals are being slaughtered, then you think, well, yeah, my campfire could hold a couple of steaks on that, or so many hot dogs up there. Then you start reading, you find out on the day they dedicated the temple, 22,000 oxen were slain and 120,000 sheep were slain. 120,000. 120,000. We don't even have herds like that around anymore, except maybe down in Australia. 120,000. This is over in, so much so they ran out of room themselves. That was an unusual experience. In 1 Kings chapter 8, 1 Kings 8, let me just give you the verses real quickly, 62 through 66. You read those on your own. 1 Kings 8, 62 through 66. So let's help ourselves understand the size of the altar burnt offering. Josephus tells us that it was 23 feet high. Now, here's your measurement of comparison. Ceilings are 8 feet. Triple that size. That's how high it was. It wasn't a campfire that you could bend over. It was something that you had to have a crane to lift you up to the top of. The altar burnt offering. And it was 75 feet square. Now, I don't know if you can, if you're impressed with the size of that. My study's about 40 feet long from front to back. That's double that size. I mean, enough for an army to be up there working. Because tens of thousands of animals were slain. Think of just the ashes that are generated. They had all types of grates and everything up there to lay the animals on. I mean, there were ways into it from the side. You had to have a way to get wood inside there. You had to have a way to get air, bellows in there to increase the fire. You had to have other ways for the ashes, and we don't know how all this worked because we don't have that around anymore. But for the ashes to fall, you know what happens whenever you got to empty a fireplace. We grew up with one, and you emptied it outside. You open your little trap door and dig all of it. Well, you fill a 5-gallon bucket up. 120,000 sheep. Think of the ashes. Think of the blood that's going to be everywhere, cutting the neck. They had to cut the neck and drain the animal. 5-gallon buckets, you'd need dump trucks to carry the blood away from all these animals. I mean, just blood, 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 flies everywhere. It was just a horrible situation. That's what has caused some of the liberal, radical critics to react against all of this. Well, that is just so grotesque, they think, how God could have been pleased with that nasty situation of Jewish sacrifice. But God was trying to teach his people a very important lesson, that sin is deadly. Literally deadly. For the wages of sin are death, Romans 6:23. And rather than the Israelite have to die, God says, I have made a way for you. If your faith will be in me and you'll obey me, then an animal can substitute for you. And then we have had the Lord Jesus Christ himself die and spill his blood and substitute for us. So you picture in your mind, you go mark out if your backyard's even big enough. For 75 feet by 75 feet. Because I know what all of our conceptions are, a little stone altar. We've even seen pictures in archaeological textbooks. You know, a little altar there that you could lay a little lamb up on top of. That's not what this is. This is as huge as a whole building and then some. 75 feet by 75 feet by 25 feet high. And it was approached, this little funny diagram here, by a ramp that led up to it from the south. No, they didn't get up by cranes then. That was just a joke. But they got up by way of a ramp, which, you know, is 75 feet wide then. 75 feet square, 25 feet tall. No one allowed in this area but the Jews, the Jewish priests and the Levites, and there would have just been hundreds of them in here, especially on festival days, to keep everything going. So you'd have to have your animals slaughtered up here. Let's say it's Passover, and we're talking about maybe 50,000 animals over just a period of, 7 days. 50,000 animals. That's a lot of cutting and slicing, and somebody's going to keep the knives sharp. And see, there are all types of things that had to be done here. This was an entire city in itself. The temple was an industry, an economy, a city in itself here. Someone to make the knives and keep them sharp and to get rid of the blood and keep the flies away. You've got expert butchers and executioners over here, and someone to carry the animals and with wagons and bring them over here and take them up the ramps and burn them and clean the ashes out, and over and over and over and over. And so with that in mind, I want to close with a passage over in Hebrews chapter 10. The law, having a shadow of good things to come and not the very image of the things, can never, with those sacrifices which they offered year by year continually. make the comers thereunto perfect. For then, if that's true, would they not have ceased to be offered? I mean, it was animal after animal, year by year, continually, hundreds of thousands over all these centuries of Jewish history, hundreds of thousands, millions of oxen and cattle and sheep lost their lives here, and their blood was spilled in this Jewish area. So again, it impresses on us the size of this all, and it impresses on us, as the writer of Hebrews says in chapter 2, this so great salvation that we have been given, that it just took one man's blood, and just one time, contrary to the Roman Catholics over and over and over again, one man's blood, one time, and he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. Verse 14, for by one offering he hath perfected forever them that are sanctified. Well, praise the Lord. You have questions tonight then?
There was no roof on those areas there, was there?
No. No roof over that area. Exposed there.
The court of the women as well as the inner court.
As well as the men's court and the priest's court. No roof over that. All exposed. There'd be roofs over these chambers along the sides here, like lepers, but not over the court. It would be exposed.
Well, how big were those gates? Were they smaller or were they huge?
Oh, they're nothing like these that we've talked about down here, because you got so many Gentiles coming in here, and you've got so many Jews coming in from so many angles, and they're coming in for other reasons. I mean, the whole temple area was not just for sacrificial purposes. I mean, it should have been, but it was for social visits and things. We saw in Mark 11 they were using it as a shortcut to get from one part of the city to another. So you'd meet your friends and talk here. And it was legitimately used for teaching purposes as well. So by far the vast majority of the people that came in here, whether they're Jewish or Gentile, would be spending most of their time down here in the court of the Gentiles. So that would not necessitate such a large gate. Other questions?
I was just trying to understand how you cook animals like that. You must have an awful hot fire.
Well, the way to heat a fire is supply oxygen to it. We know that. You ever get a fire going somewhere and it's in a closed room, it just sits there. You know, you could sit there a week or two and it won't burn anything. You open a window or two, and I mean, once the oxygen is gone, the fire can't do anything. You punch a hole in a window or in the side and you know what'll happen. You feed oxygen to a fire and it'll take off. So bellows is what'll do that. We don't know exactly how they did that. I mean, you have to kind of hypothesize some, but that's what I would suppose is some type of system that would introduce oxygen into that fire. The quicker the oxygen is introduced into there, the hotter that fire and that flame will become.
Who hauled the buckets of blood that asked?
We're going to talk about that later. That's one of the occupations there. That's one of the occupations. Of course, it has to be a Levitical person, the only one who's allowed in that court. But really wasn't so much buckets. They had a better way than that fixed up. We'll talk about that later. It would have been. It's to teach them a lesson. I mean, every time you'd get near the temple, you'd see its beauty, but you'd also be reminded of, you're supposed to be anyway, of the horrible nature of sin. When you think, I mean, it couldn't, God's trying to impress something on the Jewish person's heart. But he goes in there, I would tend to think if it were myself, I couldn't help but look at those little eyes and that little tender lamb as he was being led in there and thinking, that's not fair. It's just not fair to go and be slaughtered by the tens of thousands in there. But it is fair because God taught them that in the Old Testament. And he was trying to teach them something visually there. We don't have it visually anymore. We have to take it by faith. But visually, that could really rend a person's heart and cause you to think twice about telling a lie tomorrow like you did today and had to offer a sacrifice. You'd think twice about it then. Because a lot of times for the local native people here, they brought animals that they had raised themselves. And people become very attached to their animals, not just dogs and cats, but cattle and oxen, and I guess even an ox and sheep, lambs. You become attached to them. Name her old Betsy or old Zechariah, the cow or whatever Jewish name, and you have to go and see that thing die.